Welcome back to Shoe Leather Faith. I'm Robert McMillan, and we're continuing our series on biblical creationism. I believe that God created everything according to His perfect plan in 6 24-hour contiguous days, just like it says here in the Bible. And I'm going to stick with that until the day I die and God calls me home and says, "Hey Robert, you were right." But to deal with this, we have to cover the issue of evolution. And everybody thinks, oh, it just popped out of the ground like Darwin. Well, that didn't happen. It developed over years. And I started last time with 7 events that moved us towards the mess we're in now in our understanding of science and the creation. I dealt with deism last time, the Enlightenment being triggered by a solid Christian man, Isaac Newton, and then taxonomy, the organization of living systems by a man named Carolus Linnaeus, that was his Latin name. Then we stopped then at Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who came up with a kind of off-the-wall understanding of evolutionism at the end of the 18th century. Now we're looking at the 5th through the 7th events as they brought us to the position we're at now, where we're regaining ground. So the 5th event was that science entered the university. Now think of it. The obsession with the relation of science and religion was almost exclusively an English thing. They were struggling to find out how we could put this all together. Because the Church of England had gone south. It never been too far north, but it was really south now. And many men were going to the universities to get degrees in religion because it was an easy living. Nobody asked much of you, and they left you a lot of free time to do other stuff, like come up with ideas about evolution. So until 1830, think of it, there were 2 universities in England. I'm talking about Britain, because up in Scotland you had University of Edinburgh. Over in Ireland you had Trinity. So you had all these, you had a few universities. The 2 schools in England were bastions of the Church of England. So they wanted everybody to toe the line theologically, but they didn't really know where the line was. And they really didn't care because they were becoming deists, and they were enamored by the prestige they had by wearing fancy clothes on Sunday. Although these 2 universities had several chairs in science, they offered no degrees in science. If you went to Oxford University in the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, and you said, I want to get a bachelor's degree in botany or zoology, you couldn't get it. They didn't offer it. They had several chairs that they'd funded for science, but you couldn't get a degree there. They offered degrees in the classics and mathematics, and you could go elsewhere to a seminary and get a doctor of divinity in religion, which probably wouldn't do you much good at all because it probably wasn't too biblical. With the fascination men of education were demonstrating towards science, the growth of science as a legitimate course of study began with the 19th century. People were in love with it. Students at the schools who were dodging their other classes, their other lectures, were going to hear scientists talking about their science. By the way, the word scientist, it was coined by a man named Whewell in 1830. And Whewell has something to do with Charles Darwin a little later on. So that was the 5th event. Science entered the university. And the universities, because they were controlled by the Church of England, didn't know what to do with science. Because everybody was in love with science. It was the new bad boy on the campus. The 6th event was a man named the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus. And he was one of these guys, I don't know what kind of Christian faith he had, but there wasn't too much grace in it. And he didn't fulfill simple verses in the New Testament about loving your neighbor. But he wrote a book in 1795 and published it that year called The Principle of Population. And it became the driving force behind Darwin's concept of the survival of the fittest. That was the thing that Darwin had been missing. And he said, okay, I got this. Now I can go on and fulfill my understanding of how we all got here. He promoted the twin concepts of geometric growth of population and arithmetical growth of food supply. He said, look, if you give the poor money or food or anything like that, you're defeating the purpose of these incontrovertible laws, assuming they were incontrovertible. The implication was that population growth would always outstrip food supply. And the only thing that brought it back into line was not God's care of his population, but nature's roughness. The outstripped food supply would cause starvation and a decrease of the lower class. Because upper class people can always get something to eat. But it's the lower class people, people like us, for the most part, who are left out in the cold. Reverend Malthus opposed any law, particularly the poor laws of 1834, that supported the poor through public charity. He was against that because that kept nature from killing off all these unwanted, unnecessary people. The poor laws required the poor to move into workhouses prior to receiving any aid from the government. Now, the workhouses were just about the worst place you could think of to live in Britain at the time. They wanted to make it tough so people wouldn't want to go there. If you remember Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you remember the two men that came to Ebenezer Scrooge's office and said, would you like to give a donation to charity to take care of the poor? They were trying to raise money to support people and provide food and housing and clothing for them, to keep them from having to go to the workhouses. Ebenezer Scrooge was saying, I pay my taxes for that. Let them go there, let them die off, let them starve to death, and decrease the surplus population. I mean, that's a line right out of Malthus's book. Malthus believed that any kind of charity for the poor defeats the purpose of nature. And Darwin picked this up and said, that's what I've been missing. Nature provides for the survival only of the fittest. Everyone else dies off, or everything else dies off. In 1872, years later, a man named Thomas Carlyle, the great Scottish curmudgeon, wrote this: if paupers are made miserable, paupers will needs decline in multitude. That is a secret known to all rat catchers. In other words, you got to starve them to death. It keeps that surplus population down. Thomas Carlyle was a Scot, and I'm not proud of him. Reverend Malthus's insights into poverty and population control through harsh means of nature was the missing link for Darwin. The next was the seventh event, and that was Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. He lived from 1731 to 1802. Erasmus Darwin was well known for his speculations on evolution. He was a Lamarckian evolutionist, and he believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics. If your parents did this thing habitually, you'd develop organs and abilities to do the same thing in your life. Basically, that's Lamarckianism. He wrote several books, including Zoonomia, which espoused the form of Lamarckian evolution, all of which his grandson Charles read. Now granted, Erasmus died in 1802, 7 years before Darwin was born. So Erasmus Darwin, that grandfather, with his atheist son Robert, produced a child who had no interest in God whatsoever. Parents, be warned. You need to put this book in your child's head and in his heart so that he himself can put it down in his shoe leather and walk it in the world in his day or her day. So the eighth event was Charles Darwin himself. His grandfather was an evolutionist and an atheist. His father, Robert, was also an atheist. And he encouraged his son, first of all, to be a medical doctor, but the sight of blood made Charles Darwin violently ill. He couldn't stand the surgery. Then he encouraged him to be a pastor. Now this is a father who's an atheist encouraging him to go into the ministry, into the church, because it was an easy living. They didn't ask much of you. Boy, if only it was that way now. It could be easy now, huh? His father was an atheist, and it shows the ministry was empty of any real spiritual depth, at least in the Church of England, that they understood and that the universities would train you for. But it was a no-stress way to pay your bills. And then there was Charles Lyell, who was a big influence on Darwin. Charles Lyell wrote a book in the end of the 18th century called Principles of Geology. And in it he said, these sedimentary layers of rock demonstrate many, many tens of thousands or millions of years of deposition that produced all this. And these fossils that are in the rocks are obviously millions of years old also. And that started the circular reason we'll talk about more another time. The circular reason of the rocks are old. Why? Because the fossils are old. How do you know the fossils are old? Because they're found in old rocks. And that circular reason just went around and around, and nobody said, wait a minute. The emperor's got no clothes on. So Charles Lyell was a very important influence on Charles Darwin. And when Darwin came back from his trip on the HMS Beagle, that 5-year trip, where he stopped at the Galapagos Islands in Argentina and through Tierra del Fuego, when he came back, he called himself a geologist, and he was accepted by the academic world as a geologist. Then there's William Whewell, who had a divinity degree, a doctor of divinity, who had no time at all for God, but he had a lot of time for getting an income out of the church. And he was a good man in his own way in the days of those days. He got Darwin on the HMS Beagle. Whewell also took him on a fact-finding expedition to Africa. When he came back, he wrote about his travels, but he didn't write his book for at least 20 years afterwards. And then he wrote it and published it in 1859, and the rest is history. But he didn't do it until somebody else was getting ready, a man named Wallace. Andrew Wallace was getting ready to publish a book because he'd found the very same conclusions in his trip to Southeast Asia. And so that stirred Darwin on to write his book. And so he got it out first, and Wallace didn't complain about that. He said Darwin was there, he understood it first. So anyway, but Darwin didn't do all this in a vacuum. He did it as a result of many forces: deism, the Enlightenment, taxonomy, Lamarckianism, and he pulled that all together with Thomas Robert Malthus. So realize that everything was just set. And I believe that Satan used all of these events and all these movements and distorted what he had to and just lied about the rest. Next time, we're going to deal with uniformitarianism and catastrophism. And I'm going to show you some verses. We're going to spend most of the time in the Bible this next time. And I'm going to show you places where God shows that false teaching in the last days is prophesied to be uniformitarian in nature. So until then, keep reading your Bible, read Genesis, and believe it to be true. It is true. And we'll find out within 100 years. What Jesus said, yeah, it was all true. So until then, keep reading your Bible and be discerning.